Hey, thanks for joining me on this very fine 18th of June morning. It's the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, probably one of the most famous battles in history. But let me ask you a question. What sort of fool, as an author in the English language, would decide to write a novel telling the story of the Battle of Waterloo, not only from the French perspective, but from the point of view of two French women who fought on the battlefield on that fateful day? Yes, it was me. My name's Dave McCall. I write historical fiction under the pen name David Ebsworth, and we're bringing you this live broadcast today really to talk about the background to the Battle of Waterloo, but also about the background to the novel that I wrote back in 2014, a novel called The Last Campaign of Marianne Tambour. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about the background. And maybe just bring you a few slightly stranger than fiction stories, things perhaps that you didn't know about the Battle of Waterloo itself. Well, I'd made that decision to tell the story from a French point of view, and I got heavily involved in the research behind all of this. And suddenly I found myself in a very different world, writing about women in the Napoleonic battlefields. I knew a little bit about this already, but suddenly I found myself in this world where the women weren't simply camp followers or fever nurses, but these were women who either fought directly as soldiers in the Napoleonic battles, or perhaps were directly involved in the fighting in several different ways. These are feisty women. And when I started to do this research, I knew really I'd found the story that I wanted to tell. I'd remembered when I was a teenager, really, I'd read a book by the author Stendhal, and this is a book called The Charterhouse of Parma, and it tells the story of the hero of the tale, Fabrizio del Dongo, who finds himself in the early part of the book on the battlefield at Waterloo, and it's a chaotic telling of the battle. But the key thing for me was that Fabrizio is kind of guided around the battlefield by a woman who is simply described as a cantinière. And she has no name in the book, but she plays quite an important part in the story. And I started to research the role of these women. Now, Cantinières, or Vivandières, as sometimes known, had a really, really key role to play in the French Napoleonic armies. They were attached to each battalion, normally about 3 or 4 women attached to each battalion. They were normally married to somebody, to a soldier of that battalion, but actually these were private contractors, sutlers, who were responsible for being with the battalion right the way through, both, when they were on the road, but also in the thick of the fighting. And their duty was to provide stuff to the soldiers, provisions to the soldiers that were kind of luxury, stuff that they wouldn't be able to get from the army itself. So their tobacco ration, for instance, and alcohol and a few other things. So they do that when they were in camp, but their role in the battle on the battlefield itself was distinctly different. And each of these women carried at their side a wooden barrel, a thing called a tonnelet, and this was full of rock gut brandy. And their job was to advance with the soldiers literally to the point of bayonet, and then in the thick of the fighting to sort of run along the front lines, and to provide shots of this rock gut brandy to the soldiers. The work of keeping soldiers drunk in the British Army was very different. They were provided with gin before the battle started and so on and so forth. But these women were actually always there in the front line serving these shots of rock gut brandy. And generally, they had their children with them on the battlefield too. Lots of them thought it was the safest place for them to be, at their side. And there's a very famous picture of a woman called Katerine Balland at a battle during the Napoleonic Wars in Spain, during the Peninsular War, at a battle called Chiclana. And there she is, running along the front line of these troops serving at the Brandy, and somewhere at her side is one of her sons. In the middle of doing this research, I came across a particular story that intrigued me. And this is the story of a woman called Madeline Kindleberger, Kindleberger, I'll call her for the sake of this. She was married to a trooper of the 7th Hussars, a man called Muller, one of these dashing fellows. The Hussar regiments really were the elite among the cavalry. And she found herself, she was the Cantinière for the 7th Hussars, and she found herself on the battlefield at Austerlitz in 1805 with her children, cut off from the rest of their regiment, she, her husband, some other troopers, and her children. And they're surrounded by Russian Cossacks. She has with her 6 kids. Sometime after I found this story myself, I came across these wonderful cartoon drawings by a Spanish writer called Luis Soravilla. And he starts this little sort of comic strip of Kindleberger's exploits with a little sign with an arrow showing the way to Austerlitz, and also a little image of Madeline herself and her 6 children. Maybe I'll let Soravilla tell the rest of the story in these comic strip images. It's quite a nice thing to do, really. So one of the images shows Trooper Muller, Kindleberger's husband, being cut in half, as he was in real life, by a cannon shot from the Russians. The rest of the squad was then killed. Madeline looks on in horror when she sees this happening, but she picks up Muller's sword and she begins to fight the Cossacks, almost single-handed at this stage. The rest of the troopers are dead, and she starts to fight off the Cossacks. In the middle of the fighting, a musket ball takes off her right arm. They stab her with lances and with their sabres, and Madeline Kindleberger is captured, and so are her 6 children. And the remarkable part of the story is that she was about 7 months pregnant with twins when all of this happened on the battlefield at Austerlitz. It really is a stranger than fiction true story. The Russians take her into captivity. They deliver her twins for her, and sometime later they return her back to the French lines, where she's met by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, who's kind of astonished at this story. Almost immediately after this, I came across the story, another true story, of a woman who fought in the French ranks right the way through the Napoleonic Wars, a woman called Marie-Thérèse Figure. She's quite famous, she's quite well known. She joined the French Revolutionary Armies in 1793, and she spent the next 21 years fighting in just about every major engagement in which Napoleon's armies were involved. And she was a trooper in the 2nd Dragoons latterly, and she fought in all of those major campaigns. She dined frequently with Napoleon Bonaparte. He was completely overcome by the valour of this particular woman amongst his ranks, and she wasn't alone. There were quite a lot of women who fought in their own right during the Napoleonic Wars. And she's also the subject of a graphic novel called Marie Dragon, Marie the Dragoon. It's quite well known. It's actually very good. It's a little bit sort of supernatural, but it's got some beautiful illustrations in there. So here was the premise for my novel, that I should have a female dragoon trooper, my fictional character Liberté Dumont, and also an Imperial Guard Cantinière, who is the eponymous heroine of my story, Marianne Tambour, but also Marianne's daughter, Florisette, nicknamed Poppy, who kind of appears right the way through the story. And this is really the story of the two women and the daughter, Poppy, their fight for survival during the Waterloo campaign, the 6 days of the Waterloo campaign, but much more besides. There's lots of intrigue and spying and so on and so forth in this. And here's a little image of Liberté and of Marianne and of Poppy, drawn by our daughter Sharon. I really like the image. But the setting for the story is the 6-day campaign that took place in June 1815. And this was really the end of 22 years of constant warfare, the Napoleonic Wars, which until the catastrophe of the First World War in 1917 was known as the Great War. There were over 10 million military personnel or civilians who died during those conflicts. And the Napoleonic Wars are really important because they're the beginning of the new Europe. By the time the Napoleonic Wars ended, there was no such thing as Germany itself. There was no such thing as Italy. These were all states that grew really out of the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It was the beginning of a new Europe. And actually, it's a project that's still unfinished. We haven't quite got the end yet to what Europe will eventually look like. But its beginnings are there at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and with the Battle of Waterloo itself. Now, it's an interesting campaign because it's the end of 22 years of fighting. France is pretty much exhausted by all of this, and actually the odds in the campaign are very much against France and Napoleon Bonaparte. They're facing two very, very powerful armies. The French themselves have about 123,000 troops involved in the campaign. The Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army. You have to remember that most of Wellington's army wasn't English at all. They were mostly Dutch Belgians and so on. 112,000 of those. And then there's a Prussian army under the command of Blücher, and they have 130,000. So this is 123,000 French against the best part of 240,000 allies. So they're kind of outnumbered 2-1. And Napoleon's plan was to drive north from Paris. These two allied armies are in Belgium. To drive north from Paris, to drive right between the two of them, then to engage the first of those armies that he came across, try and defeat them, hold them at bay, and then go on to try and defeat the second, whichever he came across next. It was an audacious plan, even by Napoleon Bonaparte's standards. And over the course of just 4 days, really, between the 15th and the 18th of June 1815, the French fought no less than 6 battles. So on the 15th of June, they fought, first of all, a battle at Charleroi, just across the border. Then just north of Charleroi, they had to fight the Prussians at a place called Gilly, battle that's largely forgotten these days, but it was very, very important. Then on the 16th of June, on the day after that, a bit more than half of Napoleon's forces fought an extremely bloody battle at a place called Ligny, and the other part of Napoleon's army fought the British, the Anglo-Dutch army at a place called Quatre Bras, just south of where the battlefield at Waterloo would take place. And then on the 17th of June, pretty much a cavalry engagement, but a battle nonetheless, at a place called Genappe. And then on the 18th of June itself, there was the Battle of Waterloo. Of course, the Battle of Waterloo didn't take place at Waterloo at all. Waterloo is simply the village where the Duke of Wellington wrote up his report later that night, on the night following the battle. It actually took place near the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, south of Waterloo. and sort of between Mont Saint-Jean and an inn called La Belle Alliance. So for the French, this isn't the Battle of Waterloo at all. The French call this the Battle of Mont Saint-Jean, and for the Prussians that were involved, it's called the Battle of La Belle Alliance. It was really two battles, and there was some horrendously bloody fighting on just a few short hours on the 18th of June. The French, by then, fielded an army of 77,500, almost 78,000 troops. Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army, almost the same size, 73,000, but then coming in from the east, almost in the middle of the battle, are Blucher's Prussians, bringing in an extra 49,000. So by that halfway point in the battle, the French are badly outnumbered, and they're effectively fighting on two complete fronts. It's almost two battles in one, the Battle of Waterloo, and it leaves 50,000 dead or seriously wounded. Almost all of these people will die of their wounds. 50,000 dead on what is actually a very small battlefield. So mounds and mounds of bodies. It's quite horrendous. And there are some gruesome stories that arise out of the battlefield. They say that on the day after the battle, you couldn't buy a pair of pliers anywhere within 50 miles of the battlefield. Why was this? Because there was a new craze, and this was a craze for false teeth. And the habit at the time was to take real teeth and to fix them into dentures, and then obviously fit them to the patients themselves. It was a huge craze, and a single incisor, for example, could fetch as much as, at current values, about £300. So for the poor of the area, for the local peasant farmers and so on and so forth, this was a gift. There on the battlefield of Waterloo were 50,000 potential donors, and it spawned this enormous trade in people, looters really, sort of taking teeth from the dead and the dying, and then selling them into what was then the sort of the fledgling, the dental trade, if you like. So that was kind of one gruesome thing, and that habit of taking teeth from the dead on battlefields continued right the way through for probably the next 50 years. It was a very common practice, for instance, during the American Civil War, for people to kind of appear on the battlefields after it was all over and to take teeth. So kind of one gruesome story. And the other thing was that, there was very little respect for the dead from battles in that time. And also during the same period, for about 50 years after the Battle of Waterloo, it was very common for local farmers, for instance, or people in the trade to dig up the skeletons of the fallen who were buried in sort of mass graves on the battlefield, and to turn those into fertilizer. So a couple of really strange stories in there. And women at Waterloo, well, Madeline Kindleberger and Marie-Thérèse Figure weren't there. Both of them, Madeline Kindleberger had died by then, and Figure had retired, as I said earlier. But there were many, many women like Thérèse Jourdan, and like the woman who's very famously known as Marie Tete de Bois, Marie Woodenhead, who fought on the battlefield, and women soldiers like the Swiss soldier Regula Angel, who was wounded in the Battle of Waterloo. Her husband died on the battlefield of Waterloo. And if we do a quick calculation of the number of battalions, French battalions, times the fact that every single one of them had either 3 or 4 Cantinières or Vivandières amongst their ranks, then we know that there were at least 600 women on the battlefield at Waterloo, not behind the lines, but actually there in the front lines with their regiments. And if you want to know more about this, there's a very fine book by a writer, Thomas Cardoza, called Intrepid Women. and it's well worth a read. Marie Tete de Bois, Marie Woodenhead's story, is a particularly tragic one. She died in the last stand of the French Imperial Guard at the back end of the battle. She died there. Her son died there. His son was a drummer boy in the regiment. Her husband died alongside her on the battlefield too. And there are many records of the Cantinières who died also on that same battlefield at Waterloo. The role of Cantinière and Vivandières by now is well established in the French army, and in fact those roles continued right the way through the 19th century until 1906. They became, Cantinière, Vivandières became common in the armies of Spain and of Italy as well. And when the American Civil War began, actually women, taking this example, flocked to join the ranks of either the Confederate Army or the Union Army and served in exactly that same capacity right the way through the war. And we're blessed really because in the American Civil War, of course, we had photography, and there are goodness knows how many photographs and personal records, diaries of those particular women, and therefore we have a very clear record of the exploits, the things that they got up to. Well, Liberté Dumont and Marianne Tambour are really a sort of a composite of lots of those stories. It was great fun to write this particular novel. It took a lot of research, but it was great fun all the same. But today I just want to remember all of those people, the men and the women, of course, who died on the battlefield at Waterloo for the causes that they believed in. I'm a great fan of Bernard Cornwell and the Sharp novels, but I always like to say that actually characters like Liberté Dumont and Marianne Tambour really do put Richard Sharp to shame. Sorry, Bernard, but it's just my opinion. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you read the book and kind of see the way that, you know, I hope at least I've managed to bring some of these forgotten women back onto the pages of fiction. But if you have enjoyed it, then have a look at the book if you want to, The Last Campaign of Marianne Tambour. And if you've got any questions about any of this at all, please get in touch. You can either message me here or email me. Here are my details as usual. My website, so you can get all of the links for the books and so on, is www.davidebsworth.com. And my email, please write to me, I'm always happy to answer queries, is davemccall@davidebsworth.org. Well, thanks very much for being with me, and I hope to speak to you soon about something else that's equally interesting. Take care and stay safe.